The moment I saw the empty account balance, I knew something had shifted in my life that I wouldn't be able to undo. The number wasn't just low. It was zero. And the worst part wasn't the money. It was the calm silence in the house when I realized who had done it. I stood there in the kitchen of our Scottsdale home, staring at my phone, trying to convince myself that this had to be a banking error. But deep down, I already knew it wasn't. Because the only person who had access to that emergency fund, besides me, was my wife, Caroline Whitfield. And Caroline didn't make mistakes like this. She made decisions, deliberate ones, the kind she didn't feel the need to explain. I found her in the driveway, standing next to a car I had never seen before. A polished, deep emerald vintage Jaguar, gleaming like it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. She was smiling, not nervously, not guiltily, just pleased. I walked toward her slowly, my chest tightening with every step. "Caroline," I said, try to keep my voice steady. She turned, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, completely at ease. "What do you think?" she asked. That question hit me harder than anything else could have. Because it told me she wasn't expecting a confrontation. She was expecting approval. I looked at the car again, then back at her. "You used the emergency fund," I said. Not a question, a statement. She shrugged. A small, almost casual movement. "Real emergencies happen," she said. That sentence stayed in the air longer than it should have. Because it didn't answer anything. It redefined everything. For years, that fund had been our safety net. 6 figures set aside for things we hoped would never happen. Medical crises, job loss, family emergencies, the unplanned disasters that life throws at you when you're least prepared. We built that fund together, carefully, sacrificing vacations, delaying upgrades, saying no to things we wanted because we believed in something bigger. Security, stability, a shared understanding of responsibility. And now it was gone, replaced by a car that neither of us had ever talked about buying. "Caroline," I said again, this time quieter, that money wasn't just sitting there. She crossed her arms, leaning slightly against the car, as if it belonged to her more than the house behind us ever had. "I know exactly what it was," she replied, "and I decided to use it." There was no hesitation, no apology, just clarity, and that clarity was what unsettled me the most. "Why?" I asked. She looked at the car, then back at me. "Because I wanted something that actually felt real," she said. I blinked. "That fund is real," I said. "No," she replied, shaking her head slightly. "It's hypothetical." That word landed like a crack in something I had always assumed was solid. Hypothetical. As if preparing for worst-case scenarios was somehow less valid than chasing something tangible. Before we go further, I want you to think about this for a second. If you were standing where I was, looking at everything you had built suddenly gone, would you see this as a reckless mistake, or would you try to understand what drove that decision? Because in that moment, I didn't know which reaction would define me more. I took a step closer. "You didn't even talk to me," I said. Her expression didn't change. "I didn't think I needed to," she replied. That was the first time I felt something sharper than confusion, something closer to distance. Because marriage, at least the one I believed we had, was built on the assumption that decisions like this weren't made alone. "Caroline," I said, "this wasn't a small purchase." "I'm aware," she said. Her tone wasn't offensive. It was composed, measured, as if she had already rehearsed this conversation in her head and arrived at peace long before I showed up. "You've been working nonstop for years," she continued. "We both have. And what do we have to show for it?" I gestured toward the house. "This," I said. She shook her head again. "No," she said. "This is maintenance." That word cut deeper than I expected. Maintenance. As if everything we had built together was just a routine obligation rather than an achievement. "I wanted something that reminded me we're actually living," she said. I looked at her, trying to reconcile the person in front of me with the woman I thought I understood. "By removing the one thing that protects us if something goes wrong?" I asked. Her expression softened slightly. "Something always goes wrong," she said, "but we keep preparing for it instead of experiencing anything before it does." That was the first time I realized this wasn't about the car. It was about something that had been building quietly for a long time. A difference in how we saw risk, how we defined security, how we measured the value of time. I took a step back, exhaling slowly. So what happens if something does go wrong now? I asked. She hesitated, just for a second. Then she said, "We'll figure it out." Those 4 words should have sounded reassuring. Instead, they felt unfamiliar, because we had never been a "we'll figure it out" kind of couple. We had always been a "we've already planned for it" kind of couple. And that difference mattered more than either of us had realized. The next few days were quiet, not tense in the way people expect. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just a shift in how we moved around each other. Conversations became shorter, pauses became longer, and the space between what was said and what was felt grew wider. I kept thinking about that fund, not just the money, but what it represented. Trust, shared priorities, a mutual understanding of what mattered most. And I started to question whether those things had ever been as aligned as I believed. Caroline, on the other hand, seemed lighter. Not careless, but unburdened, as if making that decision had released something she had been carrying for years. One evening, I found her sitting in the car in the driveway, engine off, just holding the steering wheel. I stood there for a moment before approaching. "Do you regret it?" I asked. She looked up at me. "No," she said. Not defensive, not dismissive, just honest. That honesty forced me to confront something uncomfortable, because regret would have made this easier to categorize. A mistake, a lapse in judgment, something we could fix and move past. But this wasn't that. This was intentional, and intention changes everything. "Then what do you expect me to do with this?" I asked. She took a breath. "I expect you to decide what it means to you," she said. That answer wasn't what I wanted, but it was the most accurate one she could have given. Because this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about alignment, about whether 2 people who had built a life together were still building toward the same future, or if, somewhere along the way, they had quietly started heading in different directions. Be honest, I want you to answer this in your head. If the person you trusted most made a decision that revealed a completely different set of values than you expected, would you try to adapt, or would you see it as a sign that something fundamental had changed? Because that was the question I couldn't avoid anymore. Weeks passed. The financial impact became real in practical ways. We had to adjust budgets, delay plans, reevaluate things we had taken for granted. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to remind us that the safety net was gone. And with it, a certain kind of peace of mind. Caroline never brought up the car again. Not because she was hiding from the conversation, but because in her mind, the decision had already been made and accepted. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about it. Not the car itself, but what it represented. One night, sitting at the kitchen table, I finally said what had been building inside me. "This isn't about the money," I said. She looked up. "I know," she replied. "It's about trust," I continued. She nodded slowly. "And control," she added. That caught me off guard. "Control?" I asked. "You like knowing everything was accounted for," she said. "Every risk managed." "That's not control," I said. "That's responsibility." She held my gaze. "Maybe," she said, but it didn't feel that way to me anymore. That was the moment the power dynamic shifted. Because for the first time, I saw that what I viewed as stability, she had started to experience as limitation. And what she viewed as freedom, I experienced as instability. Neither of us was wrong, but we weren't aligned. And that misalignment had consequences. Real ones. Not dramatic, not explosive, but structural. The kind that changes how a relationship functions at its core. Over time, we started rebuilding the fund. Slowly, deliberately. Not because either of us had won the argument, but because we both recognized that the absence of it created a level of vulnerability neither of us was fully comfortable with. The car stayed, not as a trophy, not as a mistake, but as a constant reminder of that turning point, of the moment when we realized that being together didn't automatically mean being aligned. And alignment, as it turns out, requires more than shared goals. It requires shared definitions of risk, of value, of what it means to feel secure. We didn't end up with a perfect resolution. No dramatic reconciliation. No clear right or wrong. Just a quieter understanding that relationships don't break because of single decisions. They shift because of what those decisions reveal. And sometimes, what they reveal is something you hadn't fully seen before. Something that forces you to either adjust your perspective or accept that the version of us you believed in might need to evolve into something different.